Hello, it's Claire here. Just quickly before we start the show, I wanted to mention that I'm looking to connect with CIOs who are planning to hire information security leaders in 2020. If you're a Chief Information Officer or a Head of Technology who has information security in your remit, and you might have a tactical technical team, but you need a strategic leader, please reach out to me at www.thesecurecio.com/2020, and I look forward to hearing from you. But now, let's go to the show.
Welcome to The Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Brett King. Brett is a director and principal consultant at Unified Technology, a successful digital technology advisory business and a lover of all things technology that make our work and social lives more rewarding. He is motivated by efficiency and improvement, encouraging innovation and change, whilst also being acutely aware that in order to move forward, we need to understand and manage the technology risks around us and those that we create. Brett, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Thanks for having me.
So you work basically as a virtual or interim CIO for organisations. Tell us a bit about that work that you're doing and the types of clients that might engage you.
Often customers will bring myself and my team in when they've got a gap in their own fixed resourcing or they're looking to add a new CIO role to their organisation. That either exists as a sort of retained based effort, so sort of a light touch over a long period of time, or as an interim basis with regards to as a holding pattern before they, when they help them then recruit a replacement. We also tend to work on sort of bigger, scarier projects when it comes up to things like governance, security, strategy, transformation, program management, procurement, advisory pieces around that as well. Customer-wise, we work with a pretty diverse set of customers. In general terms, there's a bit of a flavour of government health that runs through a number of our customers. There's also a general overlay of customers having a reasonably heightened sense of awareness of where they've got either sort of risks and concerns they want to go and cover, or they've got opportunities to take advantage of. And so that tends to flavour our two pieces of work, either leveraging opportunities to implement new systems and processes and people, or looking where they've got gaps in governance and security and control, where they're looking for us to sort of help cover those and implement the appropriate practices in place.
So you mentioned that sometimes your clients ask you to do some risk and security work. What sort of exposure have you had to security teams throughout your career? I guess you've got quite a strong apps and strategy background. So what's been your experience so far as a CIO, but with this sort of security bent to your service offerings?
Prior to starting Unify, which is sort of over 2 years ago now, most of my exposure was more at the application management consulting level. So I'd rely on other security teams to have the appropriate protections in place, and I'd leverage the solutions they created to then work with our program teams to apply application-based role security to the systems we're implementing, or to understand the level of SaaS protection in place when I was working with vendor solutions. But that's certainly changed in the last 2.5 years, where in the CIO type capacity, I guess I've sort of walked into an area that is, well, I feel is being reasonably underfocused. So the piece around sort of security governance and security strategy, I feel there's a pretty good coverage of security providers out there that sort of do the do. So many good implementation partners and vendors that provide great solutions. So they'll help you, implement new hardware or software to plug gaps, and others that'll also help you implement different administration controls. But where, I guess, my work in this space started was when I started digging around the implementation of some Australian standards with regards to good IT governance. And that talked about the level of conformance to the relevant compliance obligations. And that got me digging more and more into the security concerns or the level of adherence we'd have to apply. And I just didn't feel there was some really great advice out there about what that meant. So I spent a lot of time researching that appropriately, and also making sure that we understood the detail behind the questions that were being asked by the people I represent. So that led to me researching a lot of the standards that are out there, a lot of the existing frameworks, both Australia and internationally, and then sort of digesting those into layman speak so that I could then collate that across to the executive groups that I work with to ensure that they can understand it and we can appropriately manage our response to those. So maybe back to your question, in that initially my exposure was more at the application usage level, but in the last couple of years, it's certainly dug very deeply into the bits around how I best advise customers about where they should invest their efforts to make sure they've got an appropriate level of response to the security profile that they've got in place. And that's a journey for them to learn about because, I don't know, as you get different boards and different executive groups having different levels of understanding, and it's almost a coaching role to ensure that they know how their concerns can be answered, but also that they know what they don't know. And there's a fair bit of effort needs to go into that space from my perspective. So this 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought I'd be sort of playing deeply in this space, but I guess it's been an opportunity and also a need that I felt that needed to be addressed, and something that that I'm more than happy to put my time into.
So it's interesting that you say that since you've become a consultant, you've had to really come to understand more about the security landscape and the security needs of CIOs, because it tends to be in many cases a black box or an area, a black hole for CIOs around cyber. And so for you to come in with that IT experience and advice, but also the sort of levels you've dug into around security, you can overlay that as well. I think that's an important service offering from a consulting perspective. And I know you mentioned earlier that healthcare has played a big role in your client base, but also maybe some higher education. I'm interested to know sort of what you've discovered through either of those two groups, but sort of what their approach has been to security. When you've landed there, have you had to give more advice around security, or have you found that healthcare and higher education providers have teams ready to go?
Look, from my perspective, I wouldn't say they've had teams ready to go. I also tend to operate generally in the sort of more medium-sized business side of things. So obviously people who engage our services don't have permanent full-time CIOs, so we tend to operate in that mid-level space, and it'd be fair to say as a collective they are reasonably under-resourced and under-aware of with regards to their obligations and their general level of protection that is appropriate for them. So the first part from my point of view has been maybe more the awareness part of ensuring that that they're aware of what the risks they run, so they can manage decisions about how they either mitigate those risks or manage those risks. And from my perspective, that's the major outcome I'm looking for, in that I see it as being a very professional thing to do, to understand your risks and manage those risks without addressing them, as long as they're made business decisions. And so I try and coach many of my customers around that sort of philosophy. From my perspective, a lot of the security and cyber stuff is a bit like your own personal health, in that there's a lot we all want to be healthy, and different people are happy to take on different personal activities that may risk that health, with regards to undertaking competitive sport or travelling that might expose them to different health risks to themselves. That doesn't mean they don't do those activities, that they just mitigate those risks by making sure that they've got the right level of personal levels of fitness or the right levels of medicine and other activities that mean that they still want to progress with those activities, but they do so in a risk-managed way. And from my perspective, that's a bit like an organisation, in that they can't close off all of those risks regarding cyber breach or being hacked. The same with your health. You can't stop yourself getting sick or getting injured, but what you can understand is your level of exposure, interest, and of wanting to take on positive outcomes that may expose you to those considerations. So from my perspective, that's a lot of the work I do is even in the education and health space. I think their awareness is growing very quickly, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the education providers are now providing training in cybersecurity. So in the TAFE and higher ed space, there's now Cert 4s and Bachelor and Masters in cyber, and that makes those organisations aware of some of the opportunities in those spaces. I'd also definitely say there's been a significant uplift in people's awareness with regards to the change in the Privacy Act regarding the notifiable data breach obligation to organisations to notify and breach, and also very obviously the fact that the level and the range of publication around breaches that exist for many organisations, and very, very large organisations means that there's a significant awareness at the executive and board level regarding cybersecurity, and that then creates a bit of a question culture that is growing.
Would you say that most of your engagements from a CIO perspective would include some element of security? Like, how often would your clients require you to have a security lens over what you're doing, as opposed to just giving advice around the tech space?
Probably 2/3 of my engagements aren't directly security related. So the leads that I would get in are much more around digital transformation, strategy, procurement, things like that, sort of opportunistic value adding sort of programs. But I don't now engage with any customer without ensuring that I understand what their level of cyber cover is and their level of cyber awareness is. So I can't be consulting to help them procure a new CRM system or negotiate a new contract regarding their SaaS provider or whatever it might be, and know that on the other side of the fence that they're not well protected, and that while I'm engaging with them that they could be exposed to risk they're not aware of. So with every engagement that I have now, I make sure and I provide them with a lot of the understanding that I have of what I'd expect an organisation like theirs to have in place, and they can do with that as they see fit, as long as, from my point of view, I've managed that across to them. So I get more and more inquiries about it, just because sort of, delivery creates further questions and people talk. But I don't think people are sort of actively jumping up and down, because one of the parts around that, and I don't think this is a made decision, but the more they know about their exposures, then they're obliged to go and act upon those. And that's the next level of question, in that it's, to go and do a range of assessments. It does expose you to understanding that, okay, now you know that there's certain exposures. You've got a professional obligation to manage or mitigate those risks. And I don't think that stops people asking the question, but I do make them aware that as soon as we start digging, they've got a responsibility to ensure that there's an appropriate level of response. And I also make them aware that, from my perspective, an appropriate response can be to manage those risks until they've got the resourcing capability to go and respond to them in a professional way.
So how do you help or encourage your customers to address cyber risk who probably have limited budget and resource and knowledge? You mentioned that they've got an awareness that the risk is there. What mechanism do you use to support them to try to address that?
Probably 3 main areas, I guess, depending on the organisation and industry. So firstly is their statutory obligations. Do they have obligations like the Victorian Privacy Data Security standards that they need to adhere to? And they should know that. If not, I can help them be aware of those and assess against those. For many organisations, assessing themselves against the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's risk mitigation strategies. I think there's the essential 8, and then there's, I think, in total 37 of those mitigating strategies. That's a really easy and tangible way they can assess themselves, often self-assess, against where their level of adherence or exposure might exist. So with limited investment, they can do a self-assessment against that and find out, as a bit of a touch point, where their exposures might exist. And that's the first port of call I have with many customers. The second one, and the direct overlay against that, is to ensure that they undertake a local penetration test to some depth. Because there's one thing to have theoretical compliance, there's another one to have practical compliance. And so them undertaking an external and internal penetration test against their environment, even if that's a minimum touch point, is really critical, because that gives you tangible outcomes that you can sometimes very, very quickly and cheaply go in action with regard to some configuration changes to your environment. And it also then gives a secondary lens to the theory of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's mitigating strategy. So they're probably the 3 areas, the compliance part, the Cybersecurity Centre part, and then the penetration part. And then that gives them then an exposure point about what their exposures might be. Then they can make a risk call on how they might go and address those. The important part to overlay against all of that is they've got to have an understanding, and this is something that organisations may not easily understand, is that to understand what assets they're trying to protect and what the value of those assets are and what they're trying to protect those assets from. And that's a bit more sort of, it's fine to go and understand what your risk exposure is, but different organisations have got different levels of assets to protect, and the value of those assets differs greatly depending on the organisation and the type you are, and also your own risk profile or risk posture with regard to how you take on that risk.
And I think the one piece that I'd add to that too is the risk profile and the risk posture. And certainly what is being protected is contextual, absolutely. But the extra part of the risk appetite, because, some businesses throw themselves head on at risk and kind of hope for the best, and others are very conservative. So, I think the advice is good around do the hard thinking around what your critical assets are and what you're trying to protect, and then do some really simple hygiene activities to make sure that at a minimum you've got the base levels of protection, like you've said, around the Essential 8, a network-wide pen test, and understanding your compliance obligations. I mean, at a minimum, you would think organisations would be willing to address from that perspective. I think that's really good advice.
The other part would probably be change management, in that they've got to also understand what the cultural appetite for their organisation is to implement some of the changes that might be required of them or might be suggested of them, especially regarding application whitelisting and many of the other sort of the bigger touch points. It's nice in theory to sort of try and implement some of those protections. How they go about that and their willingness of the organisation to accept them can be sometimes a reasonable program of work, whereas other organisations are, it'll come from the top down that this is what we're going to do, and that becomes part of their normal operations. So there's an important change management aspect to how you go about implementing some of those, some of the outcomes.
Absolutely. And then obviously making it just part of the way you do business. So, the awareness and then the change and then that sort of day-to-day operation part, and making sure that you don't revert back to where you were previously, because security assessments are such a point in time, like a pen test, that you kind of don't want to become complacent thinking, I've done those things, so I've ticked the box, and then, we can all move on.
It's a conversation I had recently with a customer who said, how do you make sure that your security assessment is structured, because you want to make sure you're not jumping from one thing to the next to make sure you're not inefficient, but it's also agile to make sure you can be moving with the day-to-day changes and exposures that your organization undertakes. And that's another perspective to make sure that, how often you do penetration testing is one thing, but you've got to balance up the fact that you've also got budgets and programs of work that take time to deliver, but the world doesn't stop for any of that structure, because there's new threats exposing themselves every day. So it's important that people are both highly structured and rigid in the way they're approaching it, but also have got a flexible overlay to respond to the latest threat of the day.
It sounds like when you take a piece of work that your clients become quite reliant on you to provide advice and support and activity in areas that they might have gaps in. So for the types of CIOs you're servicing at the moment, what do you think it'll look like in the future? Do you think that they will end up with security staff in-house that are dedicated, or do you think they'll continue to rely on consultants like yourself who happen to bring some security smarts with the IT transformation side of things?
I think a lot of it'll move to be much more virtual. So from my perspective, they'll be looking for external partners to assist with them. I think they'll be looking to different hardware solutions and different software solutions that can virtualize their level of coverage, because the environment moves so fast. To have the appropriately trained internal people and to be able to afford them and to be able to retain them is a significant barrier to building internal teams. So I think that the need will be there, but I think it'll be much more security as a service type model delivered via external agencies that'll help, especially those medium to large organisations, deliver their responsibilities. The other part is that there's also many other sort of services popping up with regard to AusCert and their incident response capability. So, to have the internal policy and procedure where if you do identify a breach, you then reach out to external agencies and who are expert in assisting with the response to that. I think the prevalence of organisations like those and services offered by other vendors in those spaces is going to be where the focus tends to move to, because it's going to be inefficient to have the level of expertise, ready to respond to an incident and act in the very most professional way, because you hope, and also reality is that these things don't occur very often. and therefore it's difficult to have the level of internal resource on tap to appropriately respond when you're ready. So from my perspective, there'll be much more of a community response to this, virtual. So there'll be a combination of hardware, software, external players, and advisors that will help make sure that you're ready to respond and call in the troops if and when something does happen. And even on the protection, the awareness part of it, that we'll look to use external people. Even to do with the training and awareness part. There's some really great vendors out there that offer, a lot of these things aren't new, so therefore there's no need to create them internally. So a lot of the recruitment and the resourcing of these will be by external partners and agencies where they can really focus on being the experts of their domain.
Brett, I know that some of the work you do is in regional Victoria, and I wondered, do you think there's a different level of understanding about security in business in the region as opposed to the understanding and level of knowledge in the capital cities? Do you see a difference?
I do, but I don't think I think it's more based on size of organisation and the nature of the regional centres tend to have more medium-sized organisations, and therefore their executive level tend to be very operationally focused. So they've got a challenge for spend to ensure that their focus is on making sure that their relevant business operations are performing as efficiently as they can do. So I think from my perspective, security for them is a little bit less prevalent and a little bit less on their radar because firstly, they've got many other opportunities and issues to sort of focus on, but also the calibre of resource that they've got available at their disposal tends to not have that as their general skill set. So therefore, it's just not part of their general conversations. So that's where they look to organisations such as ours to help them provide the level of coverage they need to ensure they've got the right awareness and the right response. So I don't think it's a regional versus metropolitan discussion. I think it's more of a size of organisation question. But when it comes to resourcing, they regionally absolutely struggle then to attract and retain people of the right calibre to appropriately respond. And that's where, getting back to the earlier question, that I think that they will be using many more as a service providers to cover off their security exposure and response.
If you could give other CIOs who are listening, who might be planning to or are currently responsible for the security function, what would be the one thing you would say to them to help them on the journey?
I think it's about awareness from my point of view and gut feel. My only real piece of advice is make sure you're appropriately read and informed to then understand the risks that you're assisting your organisation understand and manage. And where your gut feel doesn't feel like you've got the right answers or you don't quite understand something, dig. Because, there is no right answer to this. There's threats are changing all the time and you could spend millions and millions and millions of dollars and still be hacked and breached. So it's up to the collective us to make sure that the executive and board groups around us have the appropriate understanding, and that comes from our own personal awareness and how we manage that up to them to ensure that we're representing their interests. So from my perspective, it's, be as well researched and as well connected and as well advised as you can possibly make yourself to ensure that your gut feel and the response you're giving to those around you is as professional as it can be.
Brett, if people want to chat to you more or if they're interested to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. Brett King, or Brett Kingy is my LinkedIn short name. You'll definitely find me. We're based out of Geelong, so any search around that will find me. Also, as said earlier, run a digital consulting business called Unified Technology, and we like to think of sort of our focus being on digital technology excellence. So we want to encourage people to be excellent in the digital tech space. So if you Google digital technology excellence or look up our website, unifieddtx.com, you'll certainly find us and you can connect to me that way.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Brett, for your time today. And I really enjoyed listening to your thoughts around a few things. One is your advice around regional versus metro. I think that's really important, and those key basics around security that CIOs in those mid-tier or smaller organisations can think about. It's brilliant advice. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.